Welcome. I'm putting this together on March 5th, 2021, 50 years after MCB-40 landed on Diego Garcia and on the birthday of the Seabees. And the reason that I'm putting this together and putting this out there is that several years ago, my son digitized my slides from my time on Diego Garcia, and they've been sitting on my computer where nobody can see them. And there are many slides, many pictures, many videos of Diego Garcia across the internet on different sites, but I haven't seen hardly any, if any, of the very beginning of the military installation that is now U.S. Navy Support Facility, Diego Garcia. So while my intent is to share with people who are familiar with Diego Garcia what things were like when we first landed there and what we built when we were there, the very first things, I recognize there may be some folks who stumble onto this video and don't know much, if anything, about Diego Garcia. So I'm going to take just a few minutes at the beginning to go over just some basics about the island itself. It's located 7 degrees south, 72 degrees east, which means that it is just about halfway between Africa and Australia, located right on the equator. This sign, which was on the island, and I assume is still there or something similar, shows you how far away it is from everything. And as a merchant mariner once shared with me, and he had been to Diego Garcia, he said it is as far as you can go from the United States without starting to come back. The geographic location took on a very important role when the Mideast escalated to the point that there was more military involvement there. Diego Garcia became, and still is, an important staging ground for supplies and equipment to be used in the effort in the Mideast. And in some people's opinions, it is the most important strategic base, U.S. base in the world. That's open for discussion, but that's where it is, and that's why it is important in today's world. Here's an aerial view of the island for those who haven't seen it. Most of the activity, if not all of the activity, takes place in the lagoon. It's a protected area, safe for ships, protected for unloading, just ideal for that sort of operation. As I said at the beginning, 50 years ago this month, March, the main body of MCB-40 departed for Diego Garcia. The advance party had been there for some time and had begun construction, begun getting things ready and putting things together for the arrival of the main body. We had the best of transportation. Throw all your sea bags in the back of a 5-ton or a deuce and a half, and we'll take them to the plane. We took a DC-8, stretch 8, and after several stops, I think we stopped 3 times, 2 or 3 times, we landed on the island of Cocos. And Cocos is off the coast of Australia, and you could see on this graphic that it still is a ways away from Diego Garcia. This is the runway on Cocos, and here we are at the terminal, 10 feet above sea level. They mustered about everything that had wheels and a motor on the island and took us down to the beach where we get on landing craft to take us out to the ship, the USS Vernon County. And if you noticed in the earlier pictures, everybody looked pretty squared away. Uniforms were starched, hats were blocked, boots of shine. That all ended the minute we got in these landing craft. They turned them around, headed towards the ship. Water came over the bow, soaked us, soaked everything we owned. That was the last of the being squared away. 7 days later, we landed on the beach in the lagoon, Diego Garcia, and were met by members of the advance party. And as the Seabees always do, they always got some signs, got a greeting, so we knew we were welcome, and I'm quite frankly glad to be back on solid land, even if it was a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. This is the USS Vernon County, the ship that took us from Cocos to the island. And after we unloaded, this ship ran back and forth between Diego Garcia and Mauritius, bringing regular supplies and mail, anything we needed, on pretty much a regular basis until the runway was completed. And originally, the ship left Davisville, Rhode Island, with equipment and personnel from the advance party to go to the island. And an interesting thing, you notice it with the ship is painted white, and we asked why that was, and we were told that because it was working on the equator and it was very hot, they painted the ship white to keep it cool. Turns out that wasn't the truth. The ship was painted white because it was operating in the area of this country of India. And India is a very pacifist country. They don't support military operations at all. So the U.S. Navy painted the ship white so that it appeared that it was on a humanitarian mission. These were the accommodations. As I said, there was nothing on the island. The natives had been removed, which is a very controversial issue, but had nothing to do with us. It was done before we got there. So tents were the primary method of boarding. And I checked with a couple of three people, and as near as we could tell, we're all pretty much in agreement. It was about 3 months that we lived in the tents. If anybody knows exactly that it was different, feel free to comment. But it was about 3 months, and of course, some moved out before others as the need. The chow hall was a tent, and behind the chow hall was another tent, which was the club. And for those who served during this time, either on Diego Garcia or in Vietnam or any other isolated place, you recognize the garbage cans with the smokestacks in them. And that's where we washed the dishes. We ate out of mess kits and washed the dishes in those. So they were full of water, and one of them had soap in them, and that's how we cleaned our dishes. We had a movie theater, outdoor, of course. We had an infirmary, and I never visited the infirmary. I didn't have any medical issues. I didn't have to. But the sign, if you can read it, it's a little tough to read here. It says the Diego Garcia University Medical Center. They cared enough to send the very best. We had showers. No women involved, so the outdoor showers there was no reason to shield anything. They turned the heater on. The UT would come by and turn the heater on and heat the water up once a day. And it was in the evening, as I recall, 6 or 7 o'clock. So that was the time of day that you had to shower, when the showers were turned on. But showering in the sand and then walking back to your tent in flip-flops, you were pretty much covered in sand by the time you got back there, but at least you smelled better. This desal barge was located on the beach, and this is how we got fresh water, potable water. It took seawater and converted it into fresh water for the operation. Now, everything that came to the island had to come by boat. So commercial ships were sent to the island with various supplies and equipment. Anything that was needed was sent by Merchant Marine. And my first job was to go out to these ships, spend the day out there, and there would be a mechanic that went with me, and the mechanic would hook the batteries up and start the equipment. And then my job, after the stevedores from ACB2 had removed the dunnage that was around the tracks or tires or whatever, my job was to move that piece of equipment out in the center of the hold so that the cranes could pick it up and load it on the mike boats. Then the mike boat would transfer the equipment to shore. And after watching the stevedores down there in the hold of the ship on the equator, as hot as it was, it was brutal down there. They would take every bit of dunnage, remove every bit of it from around the piece of equipment before it was moved. So I asked if that was necessary, and they said, well, that's just the way we've always done it. I said, how about you take a couple of key pieces, I'll show you which ones, you remove them, and I'll drive over everything else. I think I could do it. They said, let's give it a try. It worked. From then on, I was the equipment operator that was supposed to be with every single ship to move the equipment because it saved them a lot of work. Here's the mike boats on the beach, and an interesting thing, and I'm not going to tell a lot of sea stories here, but I just think this is typical of how the Seabees operated. Everything that was loaded on the mike boat was documented by a storekeeper on the ship. And then when it was offloaded on the beach, it was documented once again. So 3 trucks off of the ship, 3 trucks onto the beach. 12 pallets off of the ship, 12 pallets onto the beach. Everything matched. The guys in ACB2, when we had pallets of beer or pallets of steaks, about halfway between the ship and shore, they would strip one layer off the top of a pallet. At least one pallet. And they would store it in underneath where the coxswain operated. So whatever number of pallets left the ship, balanced with the number of pallets that landed on shore, nobody ever noticed that one row was missing. And at the end of the offload, we always had a big party with steak and beer. Nobody knew where we got the steak or the beer, and nobody ever asked, as far as I know. While I was working out on the ship, they were working diligently to get more and more of the area ready to build the runway. And this is what today's runway, this is what it looked like when we started in 1971. Now you need aggregate to build a runway, and the only aggregate there was coral from the reef. So this crescent scraper was set up on the ocean side. There's a dead man at the end of the reef, a cable that the scraper is suspended from, and a draw cable. They're hooked to a crane with a drag line front, not a drag line front, but a pile drive in front on it. They drop the cable down, release the drag cable, let the crescent scraper go out to the edge of the reef, and then pull everything in to the shore and pile it up. So my first runway job was working the tides, moving that material. And I ran a 5-ton loader and loaded rock trucks with the coral from the beach. And the drivers took it up to the crusher, and the crusher started crushing material to get enough material to build the runway. And then that material was hauled out and the layers were started to put the runway in place and build it up to where it could be finished off. At that point, I was moved to the runway from the crescent scraper crew, and I had experience running a grader in civilian life, and most of the equipment operators in the operating rates were, well, we all were very young, but very few of them had equipment experience. Some had been to A school, some had not. And so it was kind of learn as you go. But since I had experience running a grader, I was assigned to the runway. Terry Pruitt, we had worked together a little bit on the crescent scraper crew, but Terry had a lot of experience running a bulldozer, and equipment is equipment, so he caught on quickly to the grader, and the two of us worked the runway. And what we would do, the runway was constructed from one side to the other. It wasn't constructed in sections, as I remember. So one would grade. Now in this particular picture, Terry's coming towards me, he's grading, I'm just backing up. When we got to the end of the runway, he would back up and I would grade going the other way. It was a very efficient way to smooth the runway, grade it, and bring it up to finished grade. Once we had the runway where they wanted it, the engineers came in and they set up wires that this machine worked off of, and this machine actually did the final grade ready for the soil cement that the runway was constructed of. So the granite, not the granite, but I'm sorry, the coral was the aggregate, and then you needed cement, and this cement came in these rubber bladders, and the dry cement was, the bladders were set in this hopper which vibrated, and they dumped the cement into a 5-ton dump truck. The dump truck, as you can see here, dumped the cement into a spreader that was calibrated to put the appropriate amount of dry cement on top of the coral. Then these large rototillers, look just like the rototiller that you would rototill your garden with, only much, much bigger, were brought in, and a water truck was hooked to them, and water was metered into the tiller at the appropriate ratio so that you had the coral, the cement, and the water coming together on the runway, in the runway, in a proper ratio to make the soil cement. That, once the water was introduced, then other tillers kept mixing until it was mixed appropriately to where the engineers said, yeah, that's the proper mixture. And at that point, it was graded. At that point, it was rolled and solid. And you could see here that what I was saying, and that the runway was built one side to the other, across. So part of it is being rolled, almost ready for the completion. Some of it is still being mixed, and some of it hasn't even had the cement yet. And so they're still working on that. Along with operating equipment, I also had experience around asphalt, liquid asphalt and paving. We didn't have any paving on the island at that time. But the liquid asphalt was sprayed on the runway at an appropriate time when the engineers said it was right to facilitate the proper curing of the soil cement so that it didn't cure too fast, it didn't cure too slow, it cured appropriately to whatever their specifications were. So in order to get the asphalt in the truck had a 2,000 gallon capacity, but as I recall, I only put like probably 700 or 800 gallons in it at a time. I had to have enough to be over the burners so that I could circulate the asphalt and heat it. If the asphalt wasn't above the burners, there was a danger of fire. So you had to somehow get the asphalt into the truck. And again, the only way you could get anything there was by ship. So the asphalt was in 55-gallon drums. And they were lifted up onto this tank with a set of barrel chimes, 3 barrels at a time. And the only way that you could open the barrels was a guy had to go up there with an axe, make a big hole in the bottom of the barrel, and then a vent hole in the top. Now, the guy in this picture was not one of the regulars that was up there. The people that got that job were the people who got in some sort of trouble on the island. So even though we were isolated, we were working all the time. Seabees, I know you're not going to believe this, but they managed to get in a little bit of a scrape. And since there was no brig and nobody could be sent home, this was one of the jobs they were given. And if you spent the day up there opening barrels until I got the 750, 800 gallons in the truck, whatever it is that you did to deserve that, you didn't do it again. Everybody learned their lesson. One time on that assignment was all anybody wanted. And again, you can see here, part of the runway has been sprayed. Part of it has been finished and rolled, but is not ready to be sprayed. Part of it, they're still working the soil cement on it. Again, working side to side. Less than 3 months, I believe it was less than 3 months, after we arrived on the island. At any rate, it was several weeks before the expected completion date, the runway was done. There was a huge incentive for us to get it done because that was going to be our connection with the outside world. This picture in 1972, I believe the runway was twice as long as when we were there in 71, because MCB1 came in behind us and the construction continued. So I believe this is 10 or 11,000, 12,000 feet long, single runway that was completed by them. This is the first C-130 that landed on the island. It was a huge, huge day. We were really excited to see this plane land because it meant that we had connections with the outside world, and we were the only place other than Vietnam that authorized R&R to Thailand. And some of the guys took R&R and were able to go to Thailand. Most of us did not because it wasn't a guaranteed thing that we could do it, and we had made payroll arrangements before we left the States that didn't leave enough money to go to Thailand, and that was probably a good thing, I'm just saying, for most of us. Here's the crew Uh, they were our heroes, the crew that landed that first C-130. That was a very special time for us. And as Seabees do, whenever we can, it was time to have a party. So we had an all-day party, mid-deployment party. This is a 5-yard bucket loader filled with ice and beer. We had hamburgers, hot dogs, all kinds of food, just one big party. This is a much younger Bill Packard, as you can tell. More hair. The hair was dark colored, but I was enjoying a cold beer. And this was the line that you got into to get the beer and you notice the beer was first, and then you got the food, which again, that's a CB thing. The guy in the yellow hat in front of me was Pruitt, and I said we were together most of the time, and we were even at the mid-deployment party. Here's the other guys in line, some of the guys, and I put this picture in so you can see that the uniform was not anything that we were worried about. Some people wore cover, some people didn't. Some people wore the t-shirt, some people wore jeans. It made no difference at these off-duty events. You had to wear some part of a uniform when you were working, but at these events you didn't. The guy in the middle here, Lincoln Hayes, he was a real character, real hoot, great truck driver, natural truck driver. Always wondered where he went, what happened to him. If anybody knows Lincoln Hayes, hook us up, get us together if you would. Oh, I'd love to say hello. So about the time that the runway was done, so were the sea huts. And clearly this is a picture taken off the internet, but and it doesn't look very appealing, but I can tell you getting in a sea hut from a tent was huge. It was so special. Again, along with the first C-130 landing, I think moving into the sea huts was the second most important time on the island. This is actually our hut, and we worked tides, and we also worked later on. We worked on a crane, and Pruitt and I worked nights anyway, some of the time, and I think that's what we were here because the shades are down on the hut because guys were sleeping during the day. But at any rate, here we are enjoying a cold beer at the picnic table that was put together outside for us, outside the hut. We drifted apart after the service, and we didn't have contact with each other. With the advent of the internet, I started looking for Terry in earnest, and I think he was kind of looking for me too. Maybe, would stumble on each other or whatever. And as luck would have it, I did find him and made a connection, actually with Tina, his wife. And we made contact and we talked, we FaceTimed. And 47 years after we were sitting at that picnic table having a cold beer, we sat at another picnic table in Evanston, Wyoming, and shared another cold beer. This was on the ranch that Terry's construction company takes care of. They do grading, bulldozing, all kinds of that sort of thing for this big ranch. And they had this area with this picnic table. So we recreated the 47-year-old picture And this picture is very special to me. The shower accommodation stayed the same. The only difference, it's not in this picture, but we did have pallets on the sand, and I think we had some of that yellow matting that was used for roadways and runways and stuff. I think that was on there. So it was a little better when you were showering. You didn't get as much sand on you, but still, by the time you got back to your hut, you pretty much were covered with sand on your legs. The runway's done. There's still quite a lot of deployment left, and certainly tremendous amount of work. So they asked for volunteers to run a crane, a drag line, and actually, I guess we were volunteered. I don't know if we actually volunteered or we were volunteered, but this is a 50-ton crane heading out from the motor pool out to the causeway that was going to be built in the lagoon. And here's how the causeway was built. Dozer crews went out 2 hours before low tide, 2 hours after low tide, and pushed coral up toward where the causeway was going to be. Because the drag line only had a limited reach. So this was as far as the drag line could reach, so we couldn't dig any further out. So they would push up for 4 hours, twice a day, and then we would dig and build the causeway 24 hours a day. It ran, one guy ran the crane, during the day, and Pruitt was second shift, I was third shift. So the daytime shift, as I recall, was 6 to 6. Pruitt was 6 to 12, I was 12 to 6. And as would happen, we were at the club one day having a few beers, and we got to feeling sorry for ourselves, and we thought that it wasn't fair that we were working nights and everybody else was working days. And this was during the day, of course, when we were there and talking about it. Probably on a Sunday, I'm guessing, because we got our courage up and we went to see the chief, the senior chief. And we pleaded our case to senior chief DePaulis. We said we didn't deserve working nights, wasn't fair. Other guys were working during the day. We'd done everything that they'd asked us to do. We even personally got a commendation or two. What was the deal? The senior chief's reply was a question. He asked us, when was the last time either one of you guys stood duty? The discussion was over. Pruitt and I left the chief's hut. We didn't complain again. Here we are out on the causeway, and it's a lot further out than it looks in this picture. I couldn't tell you exactly how far it is, but it was quite a bit further out. And this is taken from the top of the crane. Once we got out to a certain point, they had us make this big pad. And this pad was part of the operation, the future operation here. Now, the purpose of this causeway was a POL pier for fuel. It was for fuel. And the idea was that the causeway would run all the way to the edge of the reef, and tankers could come in, anchor off the edge of the reef, hook up to the pipeline, and pipe the fuel into onto the island, into the bladders that were used at the time. And my next slide will show you the bladders, and I'll get to that in a minute. But this pad was the first pad that would house whatever part of the operation was necessary. And then the causeway continued out, and there was designed to be another pad at the edge of the reef where all of the unloading equipment would be. So we're close to the end of the deployment now, and they tell us that they're going to send the engineers out and shoot some elevations, and when we can get this pad up to final grade, we're all done. And we're to take the graders to beep. The crane stayed there, but the graders went into beep. They beeped the crane there. And then we were off duty. We'd go to the beach, whatever we wanted to do until we went home. Only a week or two, as I recall, but still. So they came out, they shot the grade, and of course, some of the stakes had bullseyes. They were on grade. Some of the stakes had cut. Some of the stakes had fill. It wasn't too far off, but still. So we got word that there was going to be a big meeting up at the headquarters and the living area up at the head of the island, which is a fair distance from here, this particular day. And all of the important people from MCB 40 and MCB 1 that was coming to relieve us were going to be meeting up there from Alpha Company, at least. So that day, we got another grader, and Terry and I picked up all the grade stakes, and the ones that had cut or fill, we threw overboard. And all of them that had bullseyes on them, we kept. And we took the two graders and we graded this pad the same way we had graded the runway, back and forth. And then we shifted 90 degrees and went back and forth, did the same thing. Then we took all the grade stakes that had bullseyes on them and took them out and drove them in in the area where the engineers had it before, drove them into the bullseyes. They came out, took a look, sent the graders to beep, and we went to the beach. And I don't know how long it took anybody to discover that we weren't on grade, but it wasn't our problem because we were no longer on Diego Garcia. And these are the bladders that I spoke about earlier. This is how the jet fuel was stored at that time before there were the big storage tanks and everything else that they have there now. When I was searching for Pruitt, I came across this picture on a website that you can try to connect with people in your various units, and I didn't recognize the person, but I recognized the crane. I said, hey, that's my crane. And of course, the bulldozers were the dozers that were used out on the reef. So I looked this guy up, and it turns out Steve Hurst, and he was from New Hampshire. I connected with him, found out he lived in Alton, New Hampshire. And a couple of years ago, my wife and I went out to Alton. We met with Steve and his wife, Eva. Wonderful people, great folks. We went out to dinner that evening, and we had a big breakfast the next morning at the Masonic Lodge. And we spent that weekend reminiscing and sharing things that we had in common and things that we remembered from the island. So even though we didn't know each other on Diego Garcia that many years ago, we obviously had a lot in common because we were working side by side, and we lived in two states that were side by side. So that was great. It was wonderful to connect with Steve and spend time with him. And this fairly recent shot shows you what the runway has become in that runway area. And then where all those tanks are, that's the vicinity, I believe, where we made the causeway going out onto the reef. And you can see the edge of the reef there now where the watercolor changes. And you can also see how far it was up to where the actual base was. This sign is interesting, and I think it speaks again to the things Seabees do. Before we left, just before we left, the Enlisted Men's Club was completed. The actual building, we moved from a tent. When the building was done, this Narragansett beer sign appeared on the roof. Now, at that time, the operation, the base, was called Reindeer Station, and then it evolved into British Indian Ocean Territory, but it was Reindeer Station. When I left, and I've never heard an explanation, I never heard anything since, nobody knew how that sign for Narragansett beer, which was a popular beer in Rhode Island, where we came from, nobody knew how that sign made it from Davisville, Rhode Island to Diego Garcia, and nobody knew how it got up on the roof. So, again, that's a pretty good CB story. Somebody must have seen something, but nobody said anything, I guess. Sundays were very special. Sundays were our day off, half a day, Sunday afternoons for the first half of the deployment or so, and then all day Sunday on the second half. So it was a great time to just chill, decompress. We worked hard the other 6 days of the week. So we would get a deuce and a half from the motor pool, get some coolers, some ice, some beer, and go to the beach. And the sunsets, the scenery, never been compared to since, at least for me. It was a beautiful place. It was an absolutely wonderful opportunity for me as a CB. I didn't know it at the time, but I was very fortunate to be there and be part of the very first group that started the construction on what is now the British Indian Ocean Territory. So I thank you for watching. If you followed me this far, I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the video, the slides, and the commentary.